Today I'm going to share with you 3 absolutely baffling missing 411 cases that involve children either being stalked or taken in the woods. But before we get into those stories, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter or an experience with anything that you'd like to have shared on the show, please email me at the link below. You could join us on Facebook as well. There's a link in the description below for that. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And the next time you're going to put the subscribe button outside to go play, give it a pat on the back, tell it to be safe so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's stories. The first story is about the case of Casey Hathaway, and it happened in 2019 in Arnell in the Craven County of North Carolina. Casey was 3 years old. He was about 2.5 feet tall, weighed 25 pounds, and he was over at his great-grandmother's house on Toller Road. Casey, along with 2 other children, were playing in the yard in behind the house when the other 2 kids came inside. When they came inside, Casey's family inside the house realized that he did not come in the house with them, so they went outside to go look for him. They went outside, they started calling his name, but there was no response from Casey, and they could not see him anywhere. So they started searching the woods in behind the house. They searched for about 45 minutes and they realized that they were going to need more help. At this point, they contacted the authorities, and very shortly after, the police had showed up and they had started their own search. The police did a thorough search all around the house. They checked the woods in behind the home and they could not find any sign of Casey whatsoever. As the day progressed, more and more searchers showed up at the house to help look for him. But the police soon found that they were having to turn people away because the weather was taking a turn for the worst. The temperature was plummeting, it was beginning to rain, and just because of the weather outside and the terrain in the area, it was unsafe for searchers to continue looking for him if they were not trained search and rescue personnel, because the area is absolutely dense woods, there's sinkholes, and the parts of the area were flooded as well. When night fell, they still had not found any sign of Casey. That night, the temperature dropped to about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which is between 0 to 2 degrees Celsius, so around freezing to slightly above freezing, and hypothermia was a real concern for Casey because he was not dressed for these conditions at all. He was just wearing a light coat, pants, and shoes, plus being 3 years old, 25 pounds. It was very easy for somebody like that, a young child, to get hypothermia a lot easier than an adult, and in those conditions adults could get hypothermia pretty easily. So that was a real concern for his family, for the police, and for all the searchers. The next day, which was January 23rd, the FBI showed up along with a contingent of about 200 US Marines, and they helped join in the search looking for Casey. At one point, there was about 600 searchers on the ground, scanning all through the woods, calling out for Casey. They searched all day, but they could still not find any sign of him whatsoever. Because of the forecast, the search continued all through the night. However, the weather was a lot worse than originally anticipated. The temperature dropped to 24 degrees Fahrenheit, which is -4 Celsius, which is well below freezing, and hypothermia was even more of a concern now. That night, they used assistance of aircraft with thermal imaging, but there was still no sign of Casey. The next day, which was January 24th, the search continued, and searchers were going through a bunch of flooded areas in about waist-deep water, looking for him in ponds. At this point, the assumption was that maybe he had fallen into one of these ponds and drowned, so they had dive teams on standby to search the deeper parts of these ponds, but still there was no sign of him. At one point, based on a tip that the police had received, some searchers kind of moved out of the search area, and one of them was going through one of those spots that was about waist deep water, and he heard somebody crying, heard the sound of a child crying, and sure enough, he saw Casey on this raised piece of ground, all flooded around with water, and he was all tangled up in bramble bushes. At this point, the searcher ran over to Casey, got him unstuck from those bushes. Casey was completely soaked, but he did not appear to have any symptoms of hypothermia, and he seemed to be in relatively good health, especially considering he had just spent 2 nights at freezing and below freezing temperatures. So the searcher brought him back to the house, where he was sent to the hospital, And at the hospital, it was determined that he had no symptoms of hypothermia at all. When he was asked where he had been for the last 2 days, he said that he was hanging out with a bear and this bear was keeping him company. Now, because of his explanation of where he had been for the last 2 days, the searchers were asked if they had seen any sign of a bear in the area at all, and none of the searchers had. And his claim of spending time with a bear has never been proven by the authorities. The next story is the case of Larry and Janet McGee and Stephen Cross, and it took place on June 7th of 1951 out in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains out by Santa Fe, New Mexico. Larry at this time was 7 years old, Janet was 5, and Stephen was 3, and their two families headed up to the Santa Fe Ski Basin to enjoy a day out in nature. Where the family had set up for the day was very rugged country right at the bottom of these mountains, and the kids were kind of running around playing together. Later on in the day, the kids went into the bush to go get some sticks so that they could roast hot dogs over a fire. But shortly after, the parents noticed that the kids had not come back. So they started calling out to their children. They got no response. So then the parents started to get into a little bit of a panic mode. So they started searching the immediate area looking for their kids. After a brief search with no sign of them whatsoever, they ended up contacting the New Mexico State Police. Very shortly after that, the police arrived on scene along with a whole bunch of other searchers, and they immediately started searching this area all around where the family had been, but there was no sign of the kids whatsoever. Now, this was not a small search party. There was about 500 volunteers plus law enforcement, along with 200 soldiers from the nearby Kirkland Air Force Base, and there was still no sign of them. When night came, they set up these giant spotlights. They shone them up into the mountains in a hope that the kids would see those lights and they would come down to them. The search continued all through the night, and the next morning, searchers began making their way up the mountains and into the more dense parts of the forest all around the area. And 3 soldiers from the Kirkland Air Force Base had wandered outside of that initial search grid, and they were about 3.5 miles away from where the children had gone missing, when one of them spotted something peek up from behind a log. When they got closer to this log, they actually found that the 3 children were hiding inside this log. When the children were returned to their families and they had their med checks done, the police started to ask them questions like, why were you up there? How did you get there? And Larry, the 7-year-old, said that they were playing and they saw a bear, and the bear started coming towards them, so all 3 of them ran into the bush and started heading up the mountain while this bear was following them. He said that they walked hand in hand and that they did not want to call out because of all the bears in the area and that the bears would get you. But he also said that they were not as scared of the bears as they were of the gorilla that was looking for them, and that is why they were hiding in the log, because all night the bears were wandering around looking for them as well as this gorilla. Now, where they were found was 3.5 miles away from where they went missing. But that's 3.5 miles if you're on a perfectly flat, straight road. In the mountains or in the wilderness, you have to move around trees. You have to go over rocks. So that 3.5 miles would be more like 10 miles, which is a very far distance for children to cover, especially in that type of terrain, especially given their ages being 7, 5, and 3. Now, while bears do inhabit New Mexico, encounters with them, especially in that area, are incredibly rare. What's more interesting about the claims made by the children is that they said that they were hiding from a gorilla. Now, gorillas are not native to North America, so it really makes you wonder what exactly these children were hiding from, if they were hiding from a bear and from a gorilla. This next story is the case of James Vaughn from Idaho in 1883. James was 18 months old at the time, and his mom had to do laundry. Now, because it was 1883, they did not have washing machines like we have today, so all laundry had to be done by hand and then hung up on clotheslines outside to dry. So his mother brought him outside, put him on the ground, and then she started hanging clothes. At one point, she turned around to look at James, and he was just gone. So she immediately started searching the area around where he had been, and she could not find him. So now in a total panic, she ran down the road to the neighbor's house to see if she could get help to look for him. Word quickly spread, and pretty soon there were a ton of volunteers that had showed up to look for James. The searchers started checking the woods all around the house, but there was no sign of him whatsoever, so they started pressing further and further into the woods. At this point, one of the searchers spotted what they described as a giant bear print, and one group of the searchers ended up following those bear prints all day deeper into the woods in a hope to come across James. When night came, they were forced to call off the search, but the next morning they carried on following those same tracks. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, they were 4 miles away from where James had originally vanished when they found him lying in the fetal position on a flattened bed of weeds and grass in an area that the searchers described as looking like the lair of a giant bear. Now, James was only 18 months old, so he could not tell about the events of how he had got there. However, even though the theory was that he was taken by a bear, when he was found, he had no injuries that would be consistent with bite marks from a bear, because the only way that a bear would be able to carry anything, especially a child, 4 miles, they would have to carry it in their mouth. And he had no injuries at all that were consistent with that. So if he was taken by a bear, the real question is, how did the bear get him 4 miles from his mother to where he was found? Well, that's it for today's stories. My question for you guys is, do you think that these were really bears? Because I know a fair bit about bears, and that is not typical bear behavior at all. And I also want to know your thoughts on Larry's comment about hiding from a gorilla. I found that comment incredibly interesting. But again, thanks for joining us, and if you haven't done so already, the next time you put that subscribe button outside to go play, give it a pat on the back, and I'll see you next time.